Hey everybody, welcome back to World History. Today we're going to be doing two sections of notes in this video. Early civilizations of India and Pakistan, and then as well as the Hinduism and Buddhism presentation as well. So go ahead and get your notes out and let's get started. So, the geography of the Indian subcontinent. First off, let's define what a subcontinent is. Now, this is a large landmass that juts out from a continent. It's important to note from plate tectonics perspective, the Indian subcontinent actually slammed into the Asian continent in terms of the tectonic plates, and they rose up to form the Himalayas in terms of when they smashed together. Now, between the countries of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, they are 3/10 of the most populous region of the world, as well as the countries of Nepal and Bhutan, which exist on the borders with the Himalayas and China. Again, like I mentioned, the mountains form the northern border, Hindu Kush and the Himalayas. You have the Hindu Kush to the western part of India, and you have the Himalayas to the east. Now, there are three major zones. You have the Gangetic Plain, the Deccan. Oh, goodness, excuse me. Sorry about that. As I was saying, there are three major zones in geography of the Indian subcontinent. You have the Gangetic Plain, which is very fertile, runs along the course of the Indus River and the Brahmaputra, in terms of that region. You have the Deccan, or a plateau, or a raised area of level land, and arid, which is much more towards up here. And then you have the coastal plains, which is the eastern and western Ghats separated from Deccan, and with great access to the sea, fishing and trade were very popular there. Here's another map of the subcontinent for you. Now, in terms of weather, here in the United States, we talk about hurricane season. At the time of this recording, we are currently still in hurricane season. In India, they do have hurricanes, but they are known as monsoons due to the direction of the wind. Now, these are seasonal winds that regularly blow from a certain direction, and they define and shape life in India, whether that be due to the lack of rain, way too much rain, and flooding. As you can see from these images, it is quite common for the Indian subcontinent in some parts to flood. As you can see here, there's kids playing a game of, would-be soccer, but I believe they are playing water polo at this point because of how high the water is. So, some Indus civilizations rises and falls. The earliest Indus Valley civilizations covered the largest area in terms of that area until ancient Persia, which we've talked about previously. There's very few written records that have survived from that time period, so we don't know much about that area. And the ancient cities that they've discovered revealed a lot about the organized government at the time. But again, like I said, with there being a lack of artifacts or anything that we have access to, it's really hard to determine what was truly there. Now, the first civilizations, we have Harappa, which was located in Pakistan. It's namely in the Sindh region. Now, this is the first identified Indus Valley civilization. It's believed to possibly be a twin capital with Mohenjo-Daro, which we'll talk about in a minute. It was located along the Ravi River. It covered about 3 miles worth of area and was established in a grid pattern, meaning that there was a series of roads and that sort of thing that we could follow. Now, with Mohenjo-Daro, this is in Pakistan, specifically in the Punjab region of Pakistan. Again, believed to be a twin capital with Harappa, also 3 miles wide, and also used a street grid. Something that they have discovered in the ruins is that of an early drainage system, meaning that there actually was a way for water to be drained out of the city if necessary. Now, life in these very first civilizations were very much farming and trading based. Farmers would grow things like wheat, barley, melons, dates, and cotton, and then merchants and traders would sell those in the local markets. In terms of the religion for that time period in that region, We're assuming it's polytheistic. We don't know a whole lot about the religions of the first IVCs back then. But we do believe that they used something known as veneration or special regard to specifically cattle. If you're ever in India or that region, they view cows as sacred. It's why a primary chunk of the Indian population does not consume beef. Now, in terms of their decline, all we do know is at some point those cities were abandoned. We don't know why. It could be anything from a war to a natural disaster to a plague. We don't have any evidence as to why they did leave. So that's one of those mysteries that's kind of been left and lost to time. On top of that, we have the Aryan civilization developed in the Vedic age as well. They were primarily nomadic for a long time. They were developed an Indo-European language that is actually one of the weirdest ancient languages I've ever encountered just because of how it is presented. And they also had a number of things called Vedas, or a collection of hymns, chants, and ritual instructions. Think of it as like an early Bible of sorts. Now, it's through these Vedas that we know most of our information about the Aryans. We know that they were warriors. We know that they preferred to go out and take over places in forms of conquest, and that they valued cattle. But that's about all we do know. Excuse me. Now some changes. Eventually, they changed over from the nomadic life to farming. They settled, they learned farming and certain craft skills, and they began to develop things like iron tools and weapons. It's why back in the ancient world, we refer to this as the beginning of the Iron Age. And they also had something known as Rajas, or an Aryan chief, the most skilled war leader, and they were elected by the people. They were not there by birthright. They were elected by the populace. Now, Aryan society, they ranked groups based specifically on jobs. It didn't have anything to do with who you were married to or who you were born to. It was very much dependent on your job. So you have your Brahmins or your priests who are at the very top, your Kshatriyas or your warriors, your Vaishyas or herders, farmers, artisans, and merchants. And then you have your Sudras, which were your farm workers, servants, conquered Dravidians, and this was the lowest level of the population. And it also covered majority of the population as well. Now, their religious beliefs, they were very much polytheistic in their religion, and their gods represented nature. And this included gods like Indra, the god of war and thunderbolt, Varuna, the god of order and creation, and Agni, the god of fire and the messenger to gods. They also believed creatures like monkeys and snakes were sacred. Now, there was some changes that were coming about, one being the Brahman, or a single spiritual power that existed beyond the gods of Vedas and resided in all things, kind of like an overarching god that is the supervisor of sorts. And then you had mystics, or people who seeked direct communion with divine forces. They achieved this by going through the processes of meditation and yoga. Here are some images of various gods and deities from the Vedas. Now, epic literature. There is some stories that have come out of there that we have access to. And something known as acculturation is a big part of it. It's the blending of two or more cultures, because we truly see like a melting pot of various cultures in Aryan literature and Aryan life. They use the written language of style of Sanskrit, which I have pictured here in terms of their writing. Mahabharati tells of warfare and religion, and the Bhagavad Gita, which is Indian religious beliefs about the immortality of the soul and the value of duty. They give us a lot of insight into their specific lifestyles. And then you also have Ramayana, who teaches values of behavior, where Rama represents virtue or the ideal king, and Sita represents the ideal woman who was loyal and obedient to the husband through hardships. This is one of the many cultures that we talk about with a very reduced role for women in terms of what they were expected to do. Here's a couple of images that connect with those two pieces of literature I just mentioned. So that is it for the early civilizations of India and Pakistan. I am now going to move on to the Hinduism and Buddhism stuff. So, the belief of Hinduism developed over time with contributions from many different groups who settled into India. It is actually one of the most complex religions in the world, and Hindu teachings were recorded over hundreds of years in sacred texts called the Vedas, which I've mentioned previously. It's where we get a lot of that information. Now, despite the complexity of the religion, all Hindus have the same goal and core beliefs, this being the thing in blue. One force, Brahman, underlies everything. Again, Brahman is that overarching God that is overseeing all. Now, that is broken down into some core beliefs. The goal of life is to achieve moksha, or union with Brahman. Every person has an Atman, or essential self, and experiences reincarnation. They believe that once you died, your soul was reincarnated into a new being. And that karma holds that our actions affect our fate in the next life. So they believe that if you did a lot of bad things in this life, that you will be condemned to suffer in the next one. Now, dharma, the religious and moral duties of the person, were very much a big thing. They also practice amisha, or non-violence. Hindus are very much against the idea of violence in any way, shape, or form. They did worship many gods, being polytheistic. Their most important ones are, of course, Brahma, the creator, Vishnu, the preserver, and Shiva, the destroyer. They are essentially your big three gods of the Hinduism religion. Now, they also maintain the caste system in Hinduism. They closely linked it to their beliefs, and it maintained social order and provided people with a sense of identity. A lot of ancient civilizations that had a caste system used that as their way of justifying, well, this is how society is supposed to work. This is supposed to give you your identity as a person. So again, here's a breakdown of that. You have Brahman and then the priests and academics up at the top, the Kshatriya, or the warriors and the king, the Vaishya, or the merchants and landowners, then the Sudras, the artisans, the commoners, the peasants, and the servants. And then you have the untouchables, basically your outcasts of society, out of the caste system. They were relegated to tasks such as being the street sweepers and latrine cleaners, and were considered unclean. Now, shifting gears over to Buddhism. Buddhism emerged in the foothills of the Himalayas around 500 BC or so, and it's the teachings of a reformer by the name of Siddhartha Gautama, who was an ancient Indian prince. It began when Gautama left his palace home to find an answer to why people suffer. He grew up a very privileged life in the palace, had basically everything he wanted, but he wanted to go out and explore the world. And each time he left the palace, he left through a different gate, whether that be the north, south, east, or west gate. And each time he went out one of those gates, he learned something new about the world that was sheltered away from him while he was in the palace. Things like seeing people sick, or the dead, or people starving. Things that he did not directly experience while living in the palace. So eventually, once he left the palace and decided, I'm going to go on this path, he arrived to under a tree and sat there and meditated. He eventually became the Buddha, or the enlightened one, after meditating for months and not being tempted by a demonic temptress. Now, it's here that he determined and created the Eightfold Path, a way of life that would eventually lead to enlightenment, with the ultimate goal of reaching nirvana. No, I am not referring to the band. I am referring to union with the universe. Now, the Eightfold Path, we have this wonderful image over here, meaning you achieve the right view, right intentions, the right speech, right action, right livelihood, the right effort, right concentration, and right mindfulness. Essentially, each one of those saying you reach a certain state of being that allows your soul and your body to move on to a higher stage of enlightenment. Now, it's also here he establishes the Four Noble Truths. These include that all life is full of suffering, pain, and sorrow. The cause of suffering is non-virtue. The only cure for suffering is to overcome non-virtue. And the way to overcome non-virtue is to follow the Eightfold Path. Essentially, he believed that if you follow these Four Noble Truths and strive to follow that way of life, that you would then achieve enlightenment and reach nirvana. So Buddhism did begin to spread a lot. It was encouraged each person to seek self-enlightenment in their own way, shape, or form. This religion spread, and the Buddhist teachings were recorded on paper and shared around the world. The Buddhists also rejected the Hindu caste system because they believed that that limited people and what they were able to do. They believed that everybody had the ability to achieve a higher level of enlightenment, regardless of what part of society they were born into. So again, here's another map of the spread of Buddhism. There were two major sects that formed: the Theravada Buddhism and the Mahayana Buddhism, which are very much just regional versions of Buddhism. They still teach the same teachings, the Eightfold Path, the Noble Truths. It's just a slight variation in their practices that allows for these two major sects to have formed. Now, Buddhism itself eventually would decline in India specifically, but it did take root in a lot of other parts of Asia, becoming a major religion in countries like China, Thailand, Japan, Korea, and Mongolia, being the major religions there. So kind of just to bring it home, a couple Venn diagrams to bring us out of this. When it comes to comparing the two, there are three things that are similar in both. That being the ideas of karma, dharma, and reincarnation. Those are major tenets in both religions. Again, most of this information on here is stuff that we've already covered, so I'm not going to spend too much time going over that. So that is going to do it for notes for today. I will see you all next time. Bye, everyone.